Good evening. My name is Alexis Natty, and today I'm going to be talking and presenting on the Rwandan tragedy. I'm going to be talking about the factors that caused the Rwandan tragedy to occur in the first place, and also I'm going to be describing obviously the technology side and the impact it had on society, and also how the conflict was turned from a conflict which was based primarily on economic reasons, and how that developed into a conflict really that was based um, on racial reasons, and how that genocide occurred, which is what the Rwanda is primarily known for over the course of that conflict, and how that came about. So, to give you some background, in Rwanda you have two main demographics. You have the Tutsi population and you have the Hutu population. And prior to 1959, there was a revolution in 1959. Prior to that, the Tutsis had held power, and although they only made up about 10 to 15% of the Rwandan population, they comprised about 95% of the chiefs in the army, and also about 88% of the bureaucracy. They held a great deal of economic power in the country, and the Hutu population was primarily the peasant population, which relied very much on agriculture for its sustainability. So in 1959, a revolution occurred, the Hutu peasant revolution, and this led to many of the Tutsi aristocracy actually fled the country. They fled to neighbouring countries like Burundi, and particularly a lot of them fled to Uganda. And what this meant was that the Hutus came into power in the country. They formed a one-party regime, which was to not as much as it came about to be. Sorry, wasn't not as much as it turned out to at the time of the conflict, but it empowered the Hutus more over other demographics, particularly the Tutsis. And there was tensions that existed between the two racial groups, definitely existed. For example, during the Cold War, the USSR, Soviet Union, funded and armed Tutsi militia to perform attacks from where they were stationed in Uganda, funded and armed them to perform attacks, come over the border and attack Hutu populations. And then obviously there was a response to this by the West, particularly from France. They funded and armed as well Hutu populations to counteract that. So there has been racial tensions in the country for a long period of time, but it wasn't until the beginning of the conflict, which, as I said before, was an economic conflict, that these were really exacerbated and turned into the genocide. But I'll be talking more about how that turned into that racial genocide later. So in 1973, a military coup d'etat happened, and this was actually in northern Hutu, where much of the military is based. And Major General Juvenal Habyarimana came to power, and he formed a dictatorial leadership. He stayed in power for 20 years until his assassination in 1993, which is what sparked the turn from an economic conflict into a racial genocide. And it was his death that was used as an excuse for that, really. And it's unclear as to who was actually responsible for his assassination. There are some, or at the time it was popularized in the Rwandan media, which was Hutu Hutu owned, as the government was Hutu. This Hutu media, they popularised that it was Tutsi rebels that had shot down he was in a plane, his plane was shot down. They popularised it was Tutsi rebels that had actually shot down his plane. However, more recent studies have said that it could have been actually the Hutus themselves that shot down his plane in order to begin this war and take the emphasis off the economic reasons for war, as it was what was becoming a civil war, a civil rebellion. They feared revolution by their own people as well, the Hutu people, because there were such high economic stresses. And so some people say that it was actually an act by the Hutus themselves to facilitate a change of war, or facilitate the focus of war away from the government for the economic reasons, and more as a way to target the Tutsi, the Tutsi population, and to divert basically the blame away from themselves. So the economic stresses that came about, which led to the beginning of the conflict, this was mainly down to population growth, and in the 50 years prior to the beginning of the conflict in the early 90s, there had been a massive increase in the size of the population in Rwanda. And this had seen the population grow from 1.887 million people to 7.5 million people. So a huge increase over the course of a small period of time, just over 50 years. And this created massive economic stress in the country. Now, many people in Africa, as I said, much of the population was comprised of the peasant population, and they relied on self-sustainability from the use of their own land, and also as that to a way of work, for a way of selling goods for them to earn some money as well. So a lot of the population relies on primary sector work in agriculture. And so James Gasana, the author of the the author of the article Remembering Rwanda, he coins a term called Pembanization. And this is a term he uses which describes the situation that came about from this massive increase in population. And he says actually one of the main factors, as I've mentioned before, that led to this was actually from this appropriation of land by the peasant population. And when they divided up this land between the people, and when that was inherited by their children, the land got smaller and smaller. They couldn't sustain themselves anymore. They didn't have enough land to sustain themselves over the course of the period. And so lots of peasants were forced to sell their land to wealthy landowners who were simply, because they couldn't afford to sustain it themselves, they were forced to sell their land to wealthy landowners who didn't necessarily use the land for agricultural purposes. They used the land simply to increase the size of their estates that they owned. And so this created a lot of pressure on the land that was used for agricultural purposes, and much of the population also relied on biomass for its fuel. So biomass is like firewood to burn for your fuel. And so and what happened from this, and from the limiting of land to this massive increase in demand from the increase in population, was that it was basically unsustainable. It was massively unsustainable. So James Gasana, he cites that approximately 50% of the land used for agriculture in 1990 was on a slope of a gradient of 10 degrees or more. So the land that was used for the produce of crops was on a gradient of 10 degrees or more. And he says, because this land was on such a steep gradient, when you till the land to sow the seeds, to grow the crop, this actually erodes the land much quicker than it would if the land was flat. And he said that basically this land was being so overused, it was constantly being used to grow without enough time being allowed for nutrients and minerals to rejuvenate the soil to make it able to grow crops. They had bad crops, they had crops that couldn't grow, and also the land was just being eroded to the point that you couldn't even plant crops in it. And it was estimated that the land was eroding at approximately 8,000 hectares. This arable land was eroding at 8,000 hectares per year by 1990, which can sustain approximately 44,000 people to feed over the course of a year. So you've got this reduction in land constantly happening, and you've got this massive increase in demand for agricultural goods constantly arising as well, and it's unsustainable. And also, the demand for land came from, as I said, the use of biomass. So, as I said, many people they relied on biomass for their fuel to warm their homes, cook their food, etc., etc., etc. And in 1991, it was estimated that at the current rate of growth of forest areas, so new forest areas that were being produced by planting, etc., it would allow for about 1.9 million cubic meters of wood to be forested for use, in order to keep it sustainable. Actually, they used in 1991 4.5 million cubic meters of wood. So this obviously is a massive deficit or a massive excess in the amount of wood that was used than what is actually sustainable. So people were turning from using wood to relying on crops as well as their biomass. So there was, beyond the usual use of crops for people's food, as they didn't have a diet necessarily based on meat, they relied on a basic diet based on corn and maize. And so in addition to that, and in addition to how the demand for food from crops was increasing with the increasing population, there was also an increase in demand for the use of crops of biomass as well, which is completely unsustainable given that the land is also being reduced in its usability. So, and in addition to that, to compound that, the unemployment rate had risen to approximately 30% by 1990, and a large part of this was also because one of Rwanda's major exports at the time, and still is coffee, and the markets had crashed, and the average price of coffee had dropped to about a quarter of the price it had been before. So many people were unemployed, couldn't afford to sustain themselves, etc. And so James Gasana, he says that about 2/3 of the population at the time of the conflict were under-eating. They were becoming malnourished simply because they couldn't sustain themselves. So he has this interesting table here where he shows that there's, and if you look at the bottom in the red area, just down at the bottom, there's no violence occurred in communes where average food energy was over 1,500 calories per person per day. And it's not, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. However, he says that there was an alarming number of conflicts that happened where people were malnourished. And so this economic stress is what created the conflicts, and it was very much a rebellion in a sense, the beginning of a revolution that was based on economic stress. The peasants really they didn't have anything, they were malnourished, etc. But so how did this change from an economic conflict into a racial conflict? Well, one of the most important factors that I found was the use of media and propaganda. So up until, during the early 1991-92, there had been conflicts where there'd been attacks by multiple different groups, Hutus and Tutsis, against Hutus and both Tutsis against each other and themselves, primarily against the government, and the government was forced to allow other political parties to be allowed in the country. There was also attacks by RPF, a faction called RPF, which was a militia faction of the Tutsi party that had developed in Uganda. And there was attacks actually by them where they came over the border and attacked some Hutu peasant populations. They were actually pretty much decimated and retreated back to Uganda, but it created a lot of panic, and many of the Hutu people they formed refugee camps, they were moved out of their homes, and this created even more economic stress at the time. There was a ceasefire that occurred at the end of '92, but after a few months, this ceasefire was broken by the Major General Juvenal Ibiaramana, who was the leader of the main Hutu party at the time. He was assassinated. His plane was shot down, as I said before, and it was used. His death in the media was used by the Hutu media, which was owned by the government, and they blamed the Tutsis for his death. They said it was their fault that he died. They planned the attack, and so in the media, the Tutsis were basically they were smeared by the Hutu population, and there was a strong media campaign to smear the Tutsi population and entice an empowerment of the Hutu population. And this was basically an attempt by the Hutu government to divert the attention away from the economic problems and basically to form a scapegoat for the problems that were happening in the country at the time. And they targeted the Tutsis. For example, there was a newspaper called the Kangura, prominent newspaper at the time, and they attacked the RPF, especially, and in general the Tutsi population, and they basically racially profiled them. They had a popular article that was produced at the time called the 10 Hutu Commandments, which basically it popularized that the Hutus were superior racially to the Tutsis. And also the government at the time was actually arming, when you hear of these rebel child soldiers, this has happened in Rwanda, where from these massive refugee camps that had been formed, there were lots of orphans in them, and the government, as well as the Tutsi militia as well, the government, although, was responsible in a large part as well for recruiting these children and arming them and forming militias with them. And there was one particular militia called the Interahamwe militia, and they were responsible for much of the genocide that occurred. And they said, or I read that that these young boys, basically adolescents, were basically brainwashed to hate the Tutsi people, and so it was. So many people now say that it was a long planned attempt by the Hutu government to eradicate the Tutsis, basically. So the author James Gasana, he cites, for the future of Rwanda, in the future, to prevent such conflicts from occurring again, he says that obviously population growth was the main reason for the conflict. And obviously, as we've seen and as I've explained, this creates a massive strain on resources and also the degradation of land, which is completely unsustainable if you have such a huge amount of population growth and a limited amount of resources. So he said that there needs to be policies in place he says there needs to be policies in place that allow for better sustainability in the future. And he says one of the main ones that needs to be done is for family planning, that there should be a conscious attempt by the government to reduce the increase in population, so that it can stay at a sustainable rate. And he also says, in addition to this, like they really need to be, all of these need to be interlinked together, is that there needs to be environment conservation, so that better agricultural practices can be used that sustain the soil and that can create better harvests, and that also there's better processes used to use fuel more efficiently, maybe other types of fuel to be used so that they're not completely reliant on biomass. If there's a bad harvest, there may be, there'll be way too much demand that would be not met from if there was a bad harvest. And so he said there needs to be other methods used to basically spread the risk, rather than having it all in one place. And he says that also, as you saw in Rwanda, there was a huge difference between the rich and the poor, and there was a massive poor population, only a small amount of rich. And he says that the benefits of these things need to benefit the whole population, not just a few. And so I'm wrapping it up there. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I hope you've learned about the technologies that had effects on Rwandan society and why these conflicts occurred and how it changed into a racial conflict rather than an economic conflict. Thank you very much.